On the morning of March 17, 1983, inside a gray concrete building on the outskirts of Moscow, a man named Viktor Petrov stared at a sequence of numbers that should not have existed. The calculations were simple, too simple, and that was the problem. Viktor was 42 years old, a senior astrophysicist at the Institute for Space Research, a man who had spent 2 decades studying orbital mechanics and satellite trajectories. His work was classified, precise, and largely invisible to the world outside. He calculated the paths of Soviet satellites, predicted their degradation, and ensured that nothing floating above the Earth would fall where it shouldn't. But that morning, the numbers told him something else entirely. They told him that the Soviet early warning system, the network of satellites designed to detect American nuclear launches, had a fatal design flaw. A flaw so fundamental that it could trigger the end of the world by mistake. He sat alone in his office, the fluorescent lights humming above him, and felt the cold weight of understanding settle into his chest like lead. Outside, Moscow was waking up. Buses rumbled through Leninsky Prospect. Workers lined up for bread. Schoolchildren walked past propaganda posters showing smiling cosmonauts in steel factories. The Soviet Union was 40 years into the Cold War, locked in an ideological embrace with the United States that felt more like mutual strangulation. Both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. Both sides watched each other constantly, waiting for the first sign of attack. And both sides relied on machines to make the decision faster than any human could. Viktor had always believed in the system. He had grown up in Sverdlovsk, studied physics in Leningrad, and joined the space program with the pride of a man serving something greater than himself. He believed in science, in rationality, in the collective strength of the Soviet state. He had never questioned orders. He had never needed to. Until now. The flaw was buried deep in the orbital calculations of the OCO satellites, the eyes in the sky that scanned the horizon for the heat signature of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The satellites worked by detecting infrared radiation, the bright flare of a rocket engine igniting thousands of kilometers away. When the sensors registered a launch, an alarm would sound. A message would be sent to command. And somewhere in a bunker beneath Moscow, men in uniform would have minutes, perhaps seconds, to decide whether to launch a counterstrike. But Viktor had discovered something the designers hadn't accounted for. The satellites passed over the Terminator line, the boundary between day and night on Earth at a specific angle twice per orbit, and during certain times of the year, when the sun sat low on the horizon, its light would reflect off high-altitude clouds in a way that mimicked the infrared signature of a missile launch. It was a trick of geometry and physics, a coincidence of orbital mechanics and atmospheric conditions. But to the satellite sensors, it would look exactly like an attack. Viktor had run the calculations 17 times. He had checked the orbital parameters, the sensor specifications, the atmospheric models. He had cross-referenced the timing with historical weather data. Every simulation came back with the same result. On September 26, 1983, 6 months from now, the satellites would pass over the United States at precisely the wrong moment. The sun would be at the perfect angle. The clouds would be at the perfect altitude. And the system would register 5 missile launches. 5 phantom missiles that didn't exist. 5 false signals that could start a real war. Viktor sat back in his chair and felt the enormity of it pressed down on him like a collapsed star. He had found the flaw. He understood the danger. And now he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. In the Soviet Union of 1983, information did not flow freely. It moved through channels, through hierarchies, through layers of bureaucracy and suspicion. You did not simply walk into a government office and announce that the entire nuclear defense system was flawed. You did not write a letter to the General Secretary and expect it to be read. You followed protocol. And protocol meant going through his superior. Viktor spent the rest of that day writing a report. He kept it technical, precise, devoid of emotion. He presented the orbital data, the infrared analysis, the probability calculations. He explained the flaw in clear, methodical language, the way a scientist should. He did not speculate about consequences. He did not use words like catastrophe or apocalypse. He simply stated the facts and recommended an immediate review of the system's design. He finished the report at 9 in the evening, printed it on the department's only working typewriter, and placed it in a sealed envelope marked Urgent Classified. The next morning, he delivered it personally to his department head, Colonel Gregory Zakharov. Zakharov was a military man, not a scientist. He had been assigned to the Institute for Space Research 3 years earlier as part of the government's effort to maintain ideological control over sensitive programs. He wore his uniform even inside the building, his chest decorated with medals from wars Victor had never fully understood. He was in his mid-50s, gray-haired, with the kind of face that revealed nothing. Victor stood in front of Zakharov's desk and waited while the colonel read the report. The office was small, windowless, and smelled faintly of tobacco. A portrait of Leonid Brezhnev hung on the wall, the general secretary's face frozen in an expression of benevolent authority. Beside it was a propaganda poster showing a Soviet rocket piercing the sky, with the words, "Glory to the workers of science." Zakharov read slowly, his eyes moving across each page with the careful attention of someone who knew that every document could be a trap. When he finished, he set the report down on the desk and looked up at Victor. "You're telling me the entire ecosystem is unreliable," Zakharov said. "Not unreliable," Victor replied. "Vulnerable to a specific set of conditions that will occur in September. The system works as designed. The problem is that the design didn't account for this scenario." "And you're certain of this?" "I've run the calculations 17 times. The mathematics is clear." Zakharov leaned back in his chair and studied Victor with an expression that might have been suspicion or might have been something else entirely. "Do you understand what you're suggesting?" Zakharov said. "This system was designed by the best engineers in the Soviet Union. It was tested for years. And you're saying they made a mistake?" "I'm saying the conditions I've identified were not part of the original design parameters. It's not a mistake. It's an unforeseen consequence. And if you're wrong?" Victor hesitated. The question was not about the mathematics. It was about loyalty. "If I'm wrong," Victor said carefully, "then I've wasted your time. But if I'm right, and we do nothing, the system could trigger a false alarm. And that alarm could lead to a decision that cannot be undone." Zakharov was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the report and placed it in a drawer. "I'll pass this up the chain," he said, "but I advise you not to discuss this with anyone else. Do you understand?" "Yes, Colonel." "Good. You're dismissed." Victor left the office feeling as though he had just sealed himself inside a tomb. He had followed protocol. He had done what a loyal scientist should do. But as he walked back through the cold corridors of the Institute, he felt the weight of something he couldn't name, a sense that the report would disappear into the machinery of bureaucracy and never reach anyone who could act on it. He wanted to believe that the system would work, that the message would climb the chain of command, reach the right desk, and be taken seriously. But he had lived in the Soviet Union long enough to know better. Information did not rise. It sank. And truth was often the first thing to drown. Viktor Petrov had been born in 1941, in the middle of the war that would define his generation. His father had been a factory worker in Sverdlovsk, a city deep in the Ural Mountains, far from the front lines, but close enough to feel the weight of it. The factories ran day and night, producing tanks, ammunition, artillery shells. Victor's earliest memories were of his mother standing in line for bread, of the sound of train whistles carrying soldiers east, of the radio broadcasts announcing victories that never seemed to bring the war any closer to ending. His father came home in 1945 with a limp and a medal. He never spoke about what he had seen. He went back to the factory and worked until his lungs gave out 15 years later. Victor learned early that survival meant silence. He excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and physics. His teachers recognized his talent and pushed him toward the sciences, toward a future that might lift him out of the gray monotony of factory life. He studied hard, passed the entrance exams, and was accepted into Leningrad State University in 1959, just 2 years after Sputnik shocked the world. It was a time of optimism. The Soviet Union had launched the first satellite, sent the first man into space, and was racing ahead of the Americans in the conquest of the cosmos. Science was the new religion, and physicists were its priests. Victor believed in that future. He believed that knowledge could transcend ideology, that the pursuit of truth was the highest calling a man could have. He graduated with honors and was recruited directly into the Soviet space program. For 20 years, he worked in near anonymity. He calculated trajectories, analyzed data, wrote reports that no one outside the military would ever read. He married a woman named Irina, a high school teacher with kind eyes and a quiet voice. They had a daughter, Natasha, who grew up in a small apartment in Moscow, dreaming of becoming a doctor. Victor's life was ordinary, predictable, safe, until March 17, 1983, when the numbers stopped making sense. The days after Victor submitted the report felt like waiting for an execution. He went to work. He performed his duties. He reviewed satellite data, checked orbital calculations, and attended department meetings where no one mentioned the report at all. Colonel Zakharov treated him with the same distant professionalism he always had. There were no follow-up questions, no requests for clarification, no indication that the report had traveled any further up the chain. It was as if Victor had never written it. He began to feel the paranoia that lived in every Soviet citizen like a dormant virus, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. He wondered if his phone was being tapped, if his colleagues were watching him, if someone had flagged his name in a file somewhere deep inside Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB. He thought about approaching someone else, a colleague, a friend, but there were no friends in this kind of situation. Only witnesses. At night, he lay awake beside Irina and stared at the ceiling, calculating the days until September. "You've been quiet lately," Irina said one evening, as they sat at the small kitchen table eating soup. "Work," Victor said. "You always say that, because it's always true." She looked at him with the kind of concern that comes from knowing someone for 20 years and sensing when something has changed. "Are you in trouble?" she asked. "No," Victor said, and wondered if that was a lie. Natasha came home from school with a book about space exploration, filled with color illustrations of rockets and cosmonauts. She was 16, bright, full of the kind of hope that Victor had once felt. "Papa, can you explain orbital mechanics to me?" she asked, her voice excited. Victor looked at the book, at the smiling cosmonauts floating in their capsules, at the vision of the future that had been sold to his generation. "Later," he said. He couldn't bring himself to explain how orbits worked when all he could think about was how they might fail. On April 3rd, 17 days after Victor submitted his report, Colonel Zakharov called him back into his office. Victor stood in front of the desk again, feeling the same cold dread he had felt the first time. Zakharov did not look pleased. "Your report was reviewed," he said. Victor waited, and it was rejected. The words hit Victor like a physical blow. "Rejected?" he said. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that the designers of the ecosystem are confident in its reliability. They reviewed your calculations and concluded that the scenario you described is statistically improbable. Improbable is not impossible. In this case, it's close enough." Victor felt something shift inside him, a breaking point he hadn't known existed. "Colonel, with respect, this is not a matter of probability. The flaw exists. If the conditions align on September 26th, the system will register a false launch. And if no one knows to expect it, the response could be catastrophic." Zakharov's expression hardened. "You're a scientist, Petrov, not a policymaker. Your job is to provide data, not to question decisions made by people who understand the larger picture." "What larger picture?" "That we're willing to risk nuclear war because admitting a flaw would be politically inconvenient?" The room went silent. Zakharov stood up slowly, his face like stone. "You need to be very careful about what you say next," he said quietly. Victor realized too late that he had crossed a line. "I'm sorry, Colonel," Victor said. "I didn't mean you're dismissed," Zakharov said. "And I'm recommending a temporary suspension of your security clearance pending a review of your conduct." Victor felt the floor drop out from under him. "A review? You've demonstrated an inability to accept the decisions of your superiors. That raises questions about your reliability. I've served this program for 20 years, and now you're being asked to step back. Go home. Wait for further instructions." Victor left the office in a daze. He walked through the corridors of the institute, past colleagues who didn't look at him, and out into the gray Moscow afternoon. He had done everything right. He had followed protocol. He had reported the flaw the way a scientist should, and now he was being punished for it. The suspension came into effect the next day. Victor was told to surrender his security badge and his access to classified materials. He was not fired, not officially, but he was no longer allowed inside the institute. He spent the next 2 weeks at home, pacing the small apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. Irina asked questions he couldn't answer. Natasha looked at him with confusion and fear. "Why aren't you going to work?" she asked. "They're reviewing some of my research," Victor said. It's routine, but nothing about it felt routine. He considered letting it go, accepting the suspension, keeping quiet and waiting for the system to forget about him. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing: September 26th, the satellites passing over the Terminator line, the false alarm lighting up the bunker beneath Moscow. And the decision that would follow, he couldn't let it go. On April 21st, Victor made a decision that would seal his fate. He decided to send the message directly to the Kremlin. He knew it was dangerous. He knew it violated protocol. But he also knew that no one else was listening. He sat down at the kitchen table late at night while Irina and Natasha slept and wrote a letter. He addressed it to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He explained the flaw. He presented the calculations. He begged them to review the system before September. He signed his name at the bottom. And the next morning, he walked to the Central Post Office and sent it. He knew, even as he dropped the envelope into the slot, that it was the last thing he would ever do as a free man. The letter never reached the Kremlin. Or perhaps it did, and that was worse. Victor would never know. What he did know was that on the morning of April 28, 1983, 7 days after he mailed the letter, 2 men in dark coats knocked on his apartment door. Irina answered. Victor heard her voice from the kitchen, uncertain and afraid. "Yes? Can I help you?" "We're looking for Viktor Petrov." Victor stood up from the table, his heart hammering in his chest, and walked to the door. The men were young, clean-shaven, and expressionless. They wore civilian clothes, but there was something in the way they stood, the military posture, the controlled silence, that told Victor exactly who they were. "KGB? Viktor Petrov?" one of them said. "Yes, you need to come with us." "Why?" "For questioning." Irina stepped between them and Victor, her face pale. "Questioning about what?" she demanded. The man ignored her and looked at Victor. "Get your coat." Victor felt the weight of inevitability settle over him like a heavy blanket. He had known this would happen. He had known it the moment he mailed the letter. "Can I say goodbye to my daughter?" he asked. "No." He looked at Irina, tried to memorize her face, and then turned and walked out the door. They took him in a black Volga sedan, the kind of car that everyone in Moscow recognized and no one ever wanted to see parked outside their building. They drove in silence through the city, past the gray apartment blocks and the construction sites and the propaganda billboards showing workers with raised fists. Victor watched the streets pass by and wondered if he would ever see them again. The car turned onto Lubyanka Square, and Victor felt his stomach tighten. Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB, the building where people disappeared. They pulled into an underground garage, and the men escorted Victor through a maze of corridors, down staircases that seemed to descend into the earth itself. The walls were painted a pale green, the color of old institutions and forgotten rooms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. They brought him to a small interrogation room, bare walls, a metal table, 2 chairs. "Sit," one of the men said. Victor sat. The men left, and the door locked behind them. Victor waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. No one came. The room was cold. There was no clock, no window, no way to measure time. Victor sat in the chair and felt the silence press in on him like water. This was part of the process. He knew that. The waiting was designed to break you before the questions even started. He thought about Irina, about Natasha, about the life he had built, small and quiet and safe. And he thought about September 26th. If he was here, in this room, then no one was listening. No one was fixing the flaw. The satellites would pass over the terminator line. The sensors would register the false alarm. And somewhere in a bunker beneath Moscow, men in uniform would have to make a decision based on information that was wrong. And the world would burn because of it. The door opened. A man walked in, older than the 2 who had brought Victor here, perhaps in his late 50s, with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much and revealed nothing. He carried a thin file folder and set it on the table. He sat down across from Victor and folded his hands. "My name is Colonel Vasily Orlov," he said. "I'm with the 2nd Chief Directorate." The 2nd Chief Directorate. Internal Counterintelligence. The department that hunted spies and dissidents inside the Soviet Union. Victor said nothing. Orlov opened the folder and glanced at the contents. "Viktor Leonidovich Petrov," he read aloud. "Born 1941, Sverdlovsk. Graduated Leningrad State University, 1963. Employed by the Institute for Space Research since 1965. Married. 1 daughter. No prior infractions." He looked up at Victor. "Until now." Victor swallowed. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said. "That's not what your file says." Orlov pulled out a piece of paper, a photocopy of Victor's letter to the Central Committee. "You sent this letter without authorization," Orlov said. "You disclosed classified information to an unauthorized recipient. You undermined the credibility of a critical defense system. And you did all of this after being explicitly ordered to remain silent." "I had no choice," Victor said. "The system has a flaw. If no one fixes it, the system has been reviewed by the appropriate authorities," Orlov interrupted. "And they have determined that your concerns are unfounded. They're wrong." Orlov leaned back in his chair and studied Victor with the kind of cold curiosity that scientists reserve for specimens. "Do you know what I think?" Orlov said. "I think you're a brilliant man who made a terrible mistake. You found something you believed was important, and when no one took you seriously, you let your ego get in the way of your judgment. This isn't about ego. It's about preventing a catastrophe. Or," Orlov continued, "you're working for someone else." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Victor stared at him. "What the Americans would love to know that our early warning system has vulnerabilities," Orlov said. "It would give them a significant strategic advantage. And what better way to deliver that information than through a disgruntled scientist who feels ignored by his superiors?" Victor felt the blood drain from his face. "I'm not a spy." "Then why did you send a letter containing classified information to an unsecured address?" "Because I was trying to warn people. Or because you wanted it to be intercepted," Victor realized, with a sickening clarity that the truth didn't matter. Orlov had already decided what Victor was. The interrogation was just theater. "I've served this country my entire life," Victor said quietly. "I've never betrayed it. I never would." Orlov closed the folder. "That remains to be seen," he said. He stood up and walked to the door. "You'll be held here while we investigate," he said. "If you cooperate, this will go easier for you. If you don't, double quotes." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The door closed and Victor was alone again. The days that followed blurred together. Victor was kept in a cell, small, windowless, lit by a single bulb that never turned off. He was given thin soup and black bread twice a day. He was taken to the interrogation room every morning and asked the same questions over and over. Who did you work for? No one. Why did you send the letter? To warn them about the flaw. Who else knows about this? No one. Did you pass information to foreign agents? No. The questions went in circles, and Victor's answers never changed. But the interrogators were patient. They had time. And Victor, locked in a cell beneath Lubyanka, had nothing but time. He thought about Irina and Natasha constantly. He wondered if they had been questioned, if they were safe, if they even knew where he was. He wondered if his name had already been erased from the Institute's records, if his colleagues had been told to forget he ever existed. He wondered if the letter had ever reached anyone who mattered, or if it had been intercepted the moment it left the post office. And he wondered, more than anything, what would happen on September 26th. On the 15th day of his detention, something changed. Victor was taken to a different room, larger, with a window that looked out onto an interior courtyard. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a cup of tea waiting for him. Colonel Orlov was already seated. "Sit," Orlov said, his tone almost cordial. Victor sat and looked at the tea with suspicion. "It's not poisoned," Orlov said. "Drink," Victor drank. The tea was bitter and lukewarm, but it was the first thing other than water he had tasted in 2 weeks. Orlov watched him in silence. "We've completed our investigation," Orlov said finally. Victor waited. "We've found no evidence that you are working for a foreign intelligence service," Orlov said. "You're not a spy. You're just a fool." Victor felt a flicker of hope, fragile and dangerous. "So I can go home?" Orlov smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, the hope died. "You compromised classified information," Orlov continued. "You violated protocol. You demonstrated a lack of loyalty to the institutions that employ you. Those are serious offenses. I was trying to help. You were trying to play hero," Orlov said. "And in doing so, you created a problem that we now have to solve." Victor felt a chill run through him. "What kind of problem?" Orlov leaned forward. "The problem," he said, "is that you know too much. You know about the flaw in the OCO system. You know that we've chosen not to fix it, and you've demonstrated that you're willing to speak out, even when ordered to remain silent." "I won't say anything," Victor said quickly. "I'll go back to work. I'll forget this ever happened. Will you?" Victor nodded desperately. "I swear." Orlov sat back and studied him. "I believe you mean that," he said. "But intentions don't matter. What matters is risk. And you, Victor Leonidovich, are a risk we cannot afford." Victor felt the walls closing in. "What are you going to do to me?" Orlov stood up. "You're being transferred," he said, "to a facility where you can be monitored more closely." "A facility? You mean a prison?" "A psychiatric hospital," Orlov corrected. "We've determined that your behavior suggests a delusional disorder, paranoia, specifically. You've become convinced that a functional defense system is flawed, and you've acted on that delusion in ways that threaten state security." Victor's blood turned to ice. Psychiatric hospitals. In the Soviet Union, they were where dissidents went to disappear, where people who spoke out against the system were declared insane and locked away indefinitely, drugged into compliance, or broken through isolation. It was a sentence worse than prison, because in prison you were still a person. In a psychiatric hospital you became a diagnosis. "I'm not insane," Victor said, his voice shaking. "That's what they all say," Orlov replied. They came for him the next morning. 2 orderlies in white coats, accompanied by a KGB escort. They handcuffed him, led him out of Lubyanka, and loaded him into an unmarked van. The van drove for hours out of Moscow and into the countryside. Victor watched through the small window as the city gave way to forests and fields, as the buildings grew smaller and the roads rougher. They arrived at a compound surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. A sign at the gate read, "Special Psychiatric Hospital No. 5. Inside, the building was old and decaying. The walls were stained with mold. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something darker, sweat, fear, despair. They took Victor to a ward on the 3rd floor and locked him in a room with 3 other men. One of them sat on the floor, rocking back and forth. Another stared at the wall without blinking. The third was asleep or unconscious. Victor couldn't tell. A doctor came in later that evening. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a clipboard. "Victor Petrov?" she said. "Yes, I'm Dr. Sokolova. I'll be overseeing your treatment." "I don't need treatment," Victor said. "I'm not sick." Dr. Sokolova made a note on her clipboard. "Denial is common in patients with your condition," she said. "We'll start with a low dose of haloperidol and see how you respond." "I don't have a condition. I'm a scientist. I was trying to report a flaw in a defense system. Paranoid delusions related to state security," Dr. Sokolova murmured, writing. Typical presentation. Victor felt despair wash over him. "Please," he said, "just listen to me. On September 26th, the Oko satellites will pass over the Terminator line. The sun will reflect off high-altitude clouds. The sensors will register a false alarm. If no one knows to expect it, the response could trigger a nuclear war." Dr. Sokolova looked up from her clipboard. "That's very specific," she said. For a moment, Victor thought she might believe him. Then she wrote something else and closed the clipboard. "We'll adjust the dosage," she said. "You'll feel better soon," and she left. The days in the hospital were worse than the days in Lubyanka. In Lubyanka, Victor had been a prisoner. Here, he was a patient. And the difference was everything. They gave him pills 3 times a day. Haloperidol, they said. An antipsychotic. It made his thoughts slow and heavy, like wading through mud. His hands trembled, his mouth went dry. He felt disconnected from his own body, as though he were watching himself from a distance. The other patients in the ward were lost in their own worlds. Some of them had been there for years. Some of them had probably been sane when they arrived. Victor tried to keep track of time, but it slipped away from him. Days became weeks. The drugs made it hard to focus, hard to remember why he was there in the first place. But every night, when the medication wore off just enough for him to think clearly, he remembered. September 26th. It was coming, and no one was listening. On August 12, 1983, Victor was sitting in the common room when a new patient was brought in. The man was young, maybe 30, with wild eyes and a bruised face. He was shouting at the orderlies, struggling against the restraints. "I'm not crazy. I'm a journalist. I was writing about corruption in the party, and one of the orderlies, hit him, and the man went silent. They dragged him to a room and locked the door." Victor watched from across the room, feeling something stir inside him, a flicker of anger, of recognition. This was how the system worked. You didn't need gulags anymore. You didn't need firing squads. You just declared people insane and locked them away, and the world forgot they ever existed. Victor thought about Irina and Natasha. He wondered if they had been told he was sick, if they believed it, if they had tried to visit and been turned away. He wondered if they thought he was crazy too. That night, Victor made a decision. He stopped taking the medication. He held the pills under his tongue and spat them out when the orderlies left. He flushed them down the toilet. He did everything he could to clear his head. It took days for the fog to lift, but slowly his thoughts sharpened. The trembling stopped, the disconnection faded, and he began to plan. On September 20th, 1983, 6 days before the date Victor had calculated, he asked to speak with Dr. Sokolova. She came to his room with the same tired expression she always wore. "What is it, Victor?" "I need you to send a message," Victor said. "To whom?" "To the Institute for Space Research. To Colonel Zakharov. To anyone who will listen." Dr. Sokolova sighed. "Victor, we've discussed this." "Your delusions." "They're not delusions," Victor interrupted. "In 6 days, on September 26th, the Oko satellites will register a false alarm. I've run the calculations. I know I'm right. If you don't warn them, people will die." Dr. Sokolova looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I can't send a message based on a patient's paranoid fantasies," she said. "Then check the calculations yourself," Victor said desperately. "I can write them out. I can show you the orbital mechanics, the atmospheric models, the sensor specifications. Just look at the data." Dr. Sokolova was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll consider it. It wasn't a promise, but it was something." She left, and Victor sat on his bed, counting the days. 6 days until September 26th. 6 days until the world discovered whether he was right. Dr. Sokolova never came back. September 26th arrived like any other day. Victor woke in his bed, stared at the ceiling, and felt the weight of helplessness crush him. Somewhere above him, the Oko satellites were passing over the Terminator line. The sun was reflecting off high-altitude clouds. The sensors were registering infrared signatures that looked exactly like missile launches. And in a bunker beneath Moscow, an alarm was sounding. Victor didn't know what happened next. He had no access to news, no way to know if the system had failed the way he predicted. All he could do was wait, and hope that someone, somewhere, made the right decision. The truth would not emerge until years later. On September 26, 1983, at 0:14 Moscow time, the Oko satellite system detected 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from the United States toward the Soviet Union. The alarm sounded. A man named Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty at the command center. He stared at the red warning lights and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. 5 missiles, not a full-scale attack, but enough to destroy Moscow and several other cities. Protocol dictated that he report the alarm to his superiors immediately. They would then decide whether to launch a counterstrike. But Petrov hesitated. 5 missiles didn't make sense. If the Americans were going to launch a first strike, they would launch hundreds, not 5. It didn't fit the strategic logic of nuclear war, and the system was new. It could be wrong. Petrov made a decision that would save the world. He declared the alarm a false positive. He did not report it to his superiors, and he waited. Minutes passed, then hours. No missiles fell. No cities burned. The alarm had been false, just as Viktor Petrov had predicted. But no one knew Viktor had predicted it. No one would ever know, because Viktor Petrov had disappeared. In the psychiatric hospital, Viktor sat by the window and watched the sun set. He didn't know that he had been right. He didn't know that another man, in another bunker, had made the same choice Viktor had tried to force the system to make, the choice to question the machines. All Viktor knew was that the world hadn't ended, and that was enough. Viktor Petrov spent the next 2 years in special psychiatric hospital, No. 5. He was released in 1985 after Mikhail Gorbachev came to power and began the slow process of reform. The new government quietly emptied some of the psychiatric hospitals, releasing patients whose only crime had been speaking out. Viktor returned to Moscow, but Irina was gone. She had divorced him while he was detained, unable to bear the stigma of being married to a man declared insane. Natasha was in university, studying medicine. She visited him once, but the conversation was strained and sad. Viktor never returned to the Institute for Space Research. His name had been removed from all official records. His calculations, his reports, his warnings, all of it had been erased. He took a job as a high school physics teacher in a small town outside Moscow. He taught students about orbital mechanics and never mentioned the Cold War. He died in 2003, at the age of 62, from heart failure. There was no obituary, no memorial, no recognition of what he had tried to do. In 2013, 30 years after the false alarm, a historian digging through newly declassified KGB files found a reference to a letter sent to the Central Committee in April 1983 by a scientist named Viktor Petrov. The letter warned of a critical flaw in the Oko satellite system. It predicted a false alarm on September 26, 1983. The historian tried to trace Viktor's life but found only fragments: a suspension notice, a psychiatric evaluation, a discharge form. The calculations Viktor had written were never found, but the letter was enough to prove that he had known. He had seen the flaw. He had tried to warn them, and he had been silenced for it. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile the line between disaster and survival really was, and how often it depended on individuals the system tried to erase, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Because history doesn't just belong to the heroes who were celebrated. It belongs to the ones who were buried. And sometimes decades later, their voices rise from the archives like ghosts, reminding us that the truth never truly disappears. It only waits to be found.